crash course on Canadian Indigenous rights and reconciliation. In the wake of the discovery of unmarked graves at residential schools, there is renewed focus on the ongoing challenges facing Indigenous peoples in Canada, including systemic racism, access to clean water, and the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. Indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of Canada, who have lived here for thousands of years before European colonization. They include First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples, each with their own distinct cultures, languages, histories and rights. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government has been marked by oppression, discrimination and injustice. For over a century, many Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to residential schools, where they faced abuse, neglect and assimilation. The last residential school closed in 1996, but the legacy of trauma and intergenerational harm still affects many survivors and their communities today. Canadian Indigenous rights and reconciliation have been a complex and ongoing issue in Canada. The country's Indigenous peoples have faced centuries of marginalization, discrimination, and oppression at the hands of colonial powers, and the effects of this legacy are still being felt today. In the wake of the discovery of unmarked graves at residential schools, there has been a renewed focus on the ongoing challenges facing Indigenous peoples in Canada, including systemic racism, access to clean water, and the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. Residential schools. The residential school system is one of the most egregious examples of the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Between the 1870s and the 1990s, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to residential schools, which were run by the government and religious organizations. The schools were designed to assimilate Indigenous children into Canadian society by erasing their culture, language, and traditions. Children were often physically, emotionally, and sexually abused, and many died from disease, malnutrition, or neglect. The discovery of unmarked graves at residential school sites across Canada has brought renewed attention to this dark chapter in Canadian history. Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In response to the legacy of residential schools, the Canadian government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in 2008. The TRC was tasked with documenting the history and legacy of residential schools, and with making recommendations for reconciliation. Over the course of 6 years, the TRC held public hearings across the country, where survivors of residential schools were invited to share their stories. The Commission's final report, released in 2015, included 94 recommendations for addressing the legacy of residential schools and for moving towards reconciliation. Implementation of the TRC recommendations. Despite the TRC's recommendations, progress towards reconciliation has been slow. Many of the recommendations have yet to be implemented, and Indigenous peoples continue to face systemic racism and discrimination in Canada. However, there have been some positive steps towards reconciliation. For example, the federal government has committed to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which recognizes Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, language, culture, and traditional lands. The government has also pledged to address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to improve access to clean drinking water in Indigenous communities. Indigenous culture and heritage. Indigenous culture and heritage are an important part of Canada's national identity. The country's Indigenous peoples have a rich and diverse cultural heritage, with distinct languages, traditions, and art forms. Visitors to Canada can experience Indigenous culture through a variety of ways, including attending powwows, Indigenous cultural events, visiting Indigenous-owned businesses and art galleries, and participating in Indigenous-led eco-tourism activities. For example, the Great Spirit Circle Trail in northern Ontario offers visitors the opportunity to experience traditional Anishinaabe culture through activities such as canoeing, fishing, and harvesting wild rice. There are many examples of reconciliation initiatives across Canada that aim to raise awareness, educate people, celebrate diversity and foster collaboration. Here are some of them. 1. The National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, NCTR, is a permanent archive that preserves the records and testimonies of residential school survivors. It also provides educational resources for schools and communities to learn about this history. 2. The Orange Shirt Day is an annual event that takes place on September 30th to honor residential school survivors and their families. It was inspired by Phyllis Webstad's story of having her new orange shirt taken away on her first day at a residential school. 3. The Gord Downie and Cheney Wenjack Fund, DWF, is a charity that supports projects that promote reconciliation through arts, culture and education. It was founded by Gord Downie, the lead singer of the Tragically Hip, who dedicated his final album Secret Path to Cheney Wenjack, a young boy who died while trying to escape from a residential school. 4. The Moose Hide Campaign is a grassroots movement that encourages men to wear moose hide pins as a sign of their commitment to end violence against women and children. It was started by Paul Lacherty and his daughter Raven Lacherty, who belong to the Carrier First Nation in British Columbia. Reconciliation has a significant impact on Canadian future politics, as it involves transforming the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the federal government, as well as other sectors of society. Some of the impacts are: A. Enhancing global affairs. Canada's engagement with Indigenous peoples in Canada and globally. This means listening to, learning from, and working in partnership with First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples in Canada, as well as with Indigenous peoples around the world. B. Creating a new way of life, based on respect, truth and cooperation. This means taking responsibility for the past wrongs, acknowledging the rights and dignity of Indigenous peoples, supporting their self-determination and healing processes, and working together towards a more just and inclusive future. C. Changing the way Canadians understand their own history. This means being informed about the effects of colonization, residential schools and the racist attitudes that founded both. It also means recognizing the contributions and resilience of Indigenous peoples to Canada's culture, society and economy. D. Investing in Indigenous communities to address their needs and priorities. This means providing funding for various areas such as health care, education, infrastructure, economic development, environmental protection and justice. E. Supporting research and education on reconciliation. This means encouraging academic institutions, media outlets, cultural organizations and other stakeholders to produce and disseminate knowledge that promotes reconciliation and respects Indigenous perspectives. Reconciliation is not only a moral duty, but also a political necessity for Canada. Reconciliation affects how the government interacts with Indigenous peoples, how Canadians view their own history and identity, how resources are allocated and distributed, and how knowledge is produced and shared. These are some of the ways that reconciliation influences the future of Canada as a country. Conclusion. Indigenous rights and reconciliation are complex and ongoing issues in Canada. The country's Indigenous peoples have faced centuries of marginalization and oppression, and the legacy of this mistreatment is still being felt today. However, there have been some positive steps towards reconciliation, including the establishment of the TRC and the federal government's commitments to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and addressing issues such as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and access to clean drinking water. Visitors to Canada can experience Indigenous culture and heritage through a variety of ways and can learn about the country's complex history and ongoing efforts towards reconciliation. We hope this video has given you a taste of all the incredible experiences Canada has to offer. If you're ready to start planning your own adventure to Canada, please ensure to use our Booking.com referral link, https://www.booking.com/index.html $aid = 79893335 to book your flights, hotels, car rentals, local attractions, and more. It's an easy and kind way to support this channel and make sure you get the best possible deals on your trip. Thank you. Anhub Metaverse team at Vancouver, Canada, CA.